Welcome to Jazz Piano Skills. I'm Dr. Bob Lawrence. It's time to discover, learn, and play jazz piano. Today is Team Tuesday. Yes, you heard me correctly. Today is Team Tuesday. I am thrilled to introduce this new segment to the Jazz Piano Skills community. As all of my regular listeners know, that every Tuesday, when a new Jazz Piano Skills episode is published, it will be an episode focusing on either theory study, technique application, transcription analysis, or the learning of a tune. Now, a new segment is added to the rotation, Team Tuesday. On Team Tuesday, I am joined by another prominent jazz pianist and educator to discuss the various aspects of teaching and learning jazz piano. And of course, the audio version of the show is free for everyone to enjoy and is available through all of the popular podcast directories: Spotify, iHeartRadio, Apple, Google, Pandora, Amazon Music, Stitcher, and so on. Additionally, however, Jazz Piano Skills members can enjoy watching a video of the interview, which can be found on the Jazz Piano Skills website. There is no better way to introduce this new and exciting segment than with my special guest today. I am ecstatic to welcome to Jazz Piano Skills jazz pianist, composer, author, and educator, Jeremy Siskind. Jeremy Siskind. What a pleasure to have you on Jazz Piano Skills. Thank you, man.
Oh, I'm thrilled to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Oh, listen, this is a brand new segment that I am starting on the Jazz Piano Skills podcast, where I invite a jazz pianist like yourself, an accomplished jazz pianist, but also an accomplished jazz educator, which is tough to find. That combination, it's not easy. And so you are actually kicking things off with this whole segment. You are the very first one, man. So
it's all uphill from here, or something.
Yeah,
Something,
right? So, look, what we're going to do today is we're going to share with the listeners of Jazz Piano Skills kind of our insights and experiences as jazz pianists, as jazz educators, and as students, right? I mean, I imagine you're like me in that you still consider yourself a student.
Oh,
right?
Indeed. And I literally just signed up for some lessons these past couple of months for the first time in years to actually formally study. So I'm literally a student.
So, and that's so fantastic, I think, for listeners to hear that here you are, a monster player, signing up to study and take lessons and continue to dig deeper and to improve your skills. How amazing. It's fantastic.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, okay. So we're going to cover 4 categories. On the podcast, I kind of have a rotational lineup that I utilize on a week-to-week basis. 1 week will be I'll address a theory concept with the podcast. The next week it might be technique. The next week transcriptions. The next week tune study. And so what I thought we would do is just kind of take each one of those broad categories and kind of share our thoughts with one another and with the listeners on our experiences in each one of these categories, in each one of these areas. So I thought we'd start off with music theory, jazz theory. And the very first thing I will say is, man, there's a lot of confusion about music theory and jazz theory, and from a student perspective, with regards to its purpose and application as a player. So I guess my first question for you, when it comes to music theory in jazz theory specifically, how do you approach that with students? How much emphasis do you place upon it, and how do you approach teaching jazz theory to students?
That's a great question. I have a love-hate relationship with teaching theory. So I love theory personally. I got a double major in college. One of the majors was music theory because I just love this idea of when you hear something that you love and you want to make it a part of your own musical vocabulary, you want to go in, dive deep, figure out what's going on, and then figure out as many different ways to output it as possible, right? And it could be something as simple as somebody's using a flat nine over a dominant chord. And I did the analysis, pretty simple analysis, and then I thought, okay, I'm going to take every dominant chord and I'm going to use every flat nine that I can find. It could be something more complicated. It could be, wild substitution or, some sort of a crazy voicing and figuring out how that all relates. But for me, that's the exciting thing about theory and why it's really essential for anybody creative is, what we want to do is A, imitate, and then B, build on that imitation and find new avenues. Right. Now, I think I started by saying that I have a love-hate relationship with theory because I feel like for many students, theory can be the end point. Right. I learned the scale and therefore I know how to improvise on this chord. And that's not really healthy or the goal, right? Theory is a means to an end.
Correct.
And the end is usually more engaged with the ear and what you're hearing in your inner ear.
Right.
So for me, theory is often kind of times, I imagine as like a scaffolding that you want to kind of build it up. And then eventually you don't want to think about that theory. You don't want to be thinking about your major scale when you're playing a major chord. You want to be able to hear it and engage with that inner ear. But at some point you need to have been told or have figured out what the notes are. So theory is kind of this scaffolding for me that I try to build up with my students. And then some students have a strong ear, barely need it. Right? They'll be able to hear that scale very quickly. Some students who ear might not be their strength, they're going to need to rely on that theory for quite a while until their ear rises to that point of being able to process it. So I don't think any of us want to think about theory when we're playing, but in order to get us to a point where we're learning something new, where we're hearing something new, where we're taking something from a piece we love, whether it's a transcription or, I've done a lot of work analyzing classical music and then imitating, what's Debussy doing here? What's Bach doing here to make this work? It's all the same instrument, so why not steal from those masters as well?
Correct.
And then how can I incorporate, how can I use what Debussy did in Autumn Leaves, in On Green Dolphin Street, any of these tunes. So that's kind of a very, painting with a broad brush. That's how I think of theory. I don't want to rely on it, but it can be that booster that you get up to the next level until it's something that's really internalized in a deep way.
Yes, that's interesting. You're spot on. In fact, when I teach theory, I often teach theory without using the word theory. I like to back into it. In other words, for instance, I'll give you an example. Because what happens is students get wrapped around language a lot. They get caught up in the fancy language, like, they'll come into a lesson. They'll go, hey, I'm supposed to. I read somewhere that I'm supposed to study modes, and so they hear the word like modes, and they think, well, that's really, highbrow stuff. That's like the top of the mountain. I gotta study modes, and so they get wrapped around all this jargon. And like you said, the end is much hipper to get to than getting wrapped around all that jargon and getting tied up in knots. So I kind of like to back into it. So, using modes as an example, I'll teach students. I'll say, well, here's a C dominant scale. I don't introduce it. I don't introduce it as Mixolydian. I don't introduce it as C is the fifth of F major, so it's the F major scale starting on C. I mean, now their head's spinning around, and they're trying to go, whoa, how am I going to process all that? So, I tend to focus on shapes and sounds, teaching shapes and sounds to students, and then using theory as a way to explain or justify why they're doing what they're doing.
Yeah, and there's this problem that I think we all have as teachers of music and of jazz in general, that there's these different skill sets that you need, right? You need to know theory, you need to have good skills at the instrument,
Right.
you need to have a good ear, you need to know about history and narrative, you need to have all of these things. And some are actually easier to teach and learn than others, right?
Right.
It's very hard to teach somebody about narrative. And then,
Right.
especially, I teach in an academic setting, to give a test on how well are you able to tell a story with a solo. That's such an unquantifiable thing. You're never going to know that. Or having an individual sound, right?
Right.
I mean, like, who knows?
Right.
I have
Right.
no idea how to grade somebody on whether they have an individual sound on the instrument.
Yeah,
But
good
theory
luck,
is one of
right?
those things that's very easy to just say, okay, you got to learn your modes. And so one of the traps that I know that I fall into as a teacher, and I'm trying to do better all the time, is to not teach the things that are easy to teach and check that box off. Okay, this student knows all their modes, great. But they still can't play.
Correct.
They're not hearing it. They're not actually engaging in it.
Right.
And it's I tend to teach a lot of students who come from a classical background. And, a lot of people, especially high achievers, are oriented in like, okay, I need to check off the box of I know this thing. I need to have accomplished this exact task this week. And so things like learning a lick in all 12 keys, things like making sure that you know your modes, these are easy things to check the box of. But, really knowing something stylistically, or really, knowing your way through that scale, or hearing a passage, those are so much more difficult to teach and to learn. And then the teachers who can do that, I just admire them so much. But it takes a lot of discipline to be able to tell your students, okay, we could learn the name of that thing, and we could, do a theory exercise, but actually it's not really the most essential thing that you need, especially when students come in and they've watched some YouTube tutorial and they said, I heard that we were supposed to use the bebop scale, from this. And it's like, okay, that's good information, but it's not actually speaking the language. It's not actually, getting you to a place where you're going to be telling a story and making, an individual statement of any kind.
Yeah, well, and you touch upon another topic I want to discuss real quick, just the abundance of information that now is available to people and to students, right? I actually have to ban students from YouTube.
Do you really?
Stop going. Yeah, I go, just that you're banned from YouTube, man. Just stop looking at, because now there's so much information that's floating around out there, not just in any area, right? Not just jazz and jazz piano. I mean, you can go health and fitness, and I mean, there's so much information that's out there, and so how do you safeguard students? How do you teach students to know how to be able to assess when they're actually touching upon or discovering something that's legit when it comes to jazz theory, and something that is like a little whacked? How do you address that?
I don't know if I have a great answer to that question, honestly.
Yeah.
I'm going to kind of dodge that question and say that my bigger concern, I guess I'm not against, like, I'm not somebody who's going to say, don't do this, don't look at this, don't listen to this person.
Right.
But my biggest concern is making sure that they get to the good information, because there's so many, there's so much other stuff that instead of spending their time listening to Oscar Peterson, Bill Evans, Thelonious Monk, Hank Jones, Miles Davis, John Coltrane, et cetera, they're watching a YouTube tutorial by a guy who may or may not really know what they're talking about. And so, like, I don't think any of that input is necessarily bad. I don't see a ton of, like, damaging videos out there. But my main concern is, like, how many solos can you sing? Right? If you can't sing any solos on the spot, nothing much is going to happen for you. You can watch YouTube tutorials all day. You can, know all those things. But it's like, to me, it's the balance of depth and breadth. And it's so easy to pursue breadth because there's so much out there. They can watch Jacob Collier videos about the negative harmony, which I still don't honestly understand. But you can't sing a single solo. And it's like, well, you're not really learning anything. You might think that you're an expert because you watched all these videos, but you're not doing anything with any depth. So I guess more than saying no to stuff, it's more like you got to put your time into the real stuff.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great answer, and you're actually talking about actually doing more listening. Do a lot of listening, right? You just mentioned about being able to sing solos, right? We all have those albums that we grew up, different albums that we've listened to throughout our lives that you could literally you don't even need the album anymore. You can just drive along in your car and sing the solos. So, yeah, that's a great bit of advice, to always be pointing to the good stuff, right? And quite honestly, like, you also bring up a really valid point too. I used to have a teacher that used to say to me all the time, used to say, Bob, you can learn something from everyone. You can learn something from everyone.
No
And I think
doubt.
that's really good advice.
Yeah, I'm not against people learning from other sources, and they're my
Yeah.
student. By all means, take in some information.
Right.
But
Right.
again, as long as you're pursuing some things with a real high level of depth. Like I'll give you the example that I told you I've been taking lessons. Hopefully, it's not weird to say I've been taking lessons from Gerald Clayton. He's one of my favorite pianists. Just total, I think, beast of
Awesome.
modern music. And first week we were working on playing at slow tempos. He had me transcribe this Oscar Peterson solo, and I'm kind of a brown noser go getter as a student. So I transcribed the left hand and the right hand. I learned it exactly with the recording, and I was like feeling really good about myself. And I sent him a copy of the transcription, and it was like, and killed it at the lesson. He said, "This is great, but I wonder if you spend enough time with the solo before you put it down into writing." Or did you just kind of go and write it down from the recording? And I had to admit that I went right to it, and I was like, I'm going to impress him, and I wrote it right down. And he said, well, that's good, but I don't know if you learned it with as much depth as if you had really spent that time so that you could play it without even writing it down. And so the next week,
Yeah.
I learned a Chick Corea solo without writing it down. And I'll tell you, in total honesty, I know that second solo way better than I know that first one. And it was way harder and took way more time. But
Yeah,
the
that's interesting.
accomplishment, the reward that I'm getting from it is so much greater. So even I am guilty. We could all always do better. But even
Absolutely.
from whatever position of high stature I'm in, I got called out for not going into enough depth on my assignment, and that was a great lesson for me.
Oh, that's fantastic. So let's
Yeah.
talk a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about technique, right?
Okay.
Everyone gets after it. Practicing scales, practicing arpeggios. But share with the listeners how you practice scales, how you practice arpeggios, how you take those exercises, and how do those get translated into vocabulary for you?
Yeah, good question. And the answer is that it's constantly, for me at least, it's constantly changing. And, scales are just one of those things that they're always a part of your practice routine. And you can always figure out a different way to practice them. And they're always going to be useful, and you can never know them well enough. There's
True.
always other scales, there's always other rhythms, other patterns. And so I'm more than saying that there's a particular way that you should be practicing scales. I'm just a big advocate for always finding something that pushes you to a new level with practicing scales. If you're bored of playing them up and down, of course, play them in all the different intervals. Play them in thirds, play them in fourths, play them in fifths. Play them in, block them out in triads and see how fast you can play them blocked out in triads. Play them in ascending fourths. Play them melodic minor, play them in 5 tuplets. There's just no end to that practice. And for me, it's something that kind of fugues throughout my life. Sometimes I
Right.
remind myself that I really need to get into scales, and I have some exercise that really excites me. For a while, I was working really hard on playing them in tenths and getting that really solid. And then for a while, I don't have time, or I get off of scales, and then I come back to them.
Right.
For a lot of my students, in addition to scales, I'm just a big fan of having them learn bebop melodies or bebop solos, because, for me, bebop is kind of the standard language of jazz.
Right.
No matter
Right.
no matter whether you want to play an earlier style or a later standard style, understanding bebop is just kind of essential. So getting those sorts of things under your fingers to me are like kind of as essential as playing scales. So, I love having them play the Bud Powell heads, like Celia, like Bouncing with Bud, of course, all the Charlie Parker heads, your Anthropology, your Confirmation, just to get used to spreading your hands in different ways. And the kind of turns that take place that, especially, like I said, I do a lot of teaching of classical musicians who start playing jazz, and they're not used to kind of these weird leaps and then descending and ascending and then leaping a seventh and then coming back. So to get their hands just used to talking that way, I think is really useful. Yeah. And I kind of consider that an essential part of practice, like scales.
Yeah, so just playing the heads, right? Just playing the heads of those tunes.
Yeah, I mean, the solos are great too, but the heads are the things that the people, said, this is good enough that I want to make it a tune. So, heck, spend time with that. And then you're doing double duty. You've learned a tune too.
Right.
So I'm all for learning as many bebop heads as possible.
Yeah, because there's just that's a treasure in and of itself. Just playing those heads just teach you so much about the vocabulary, about the lines.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So
and they're hard. They're good exercises, in terms of getting loose. I was using as a warm up. If I can demonstrate, I've been doing this stupid thing with mirror piano, which is where you kind of have the two hands playing symmetrically. So for quite a while, my big warm up was playing Donnelly. So with the left hand mirroring, and then the left hand playing the melody with the right hand mirroring. In a whole different way than scale. I have to spread my hands.
Oh my God.
The other thing that I like doing is I have a few etudes, and shame on me, I haven't updated in a couple of years, but I have a few etudes. I really like six. Six really get me working between the fourth and the fifth finger, because that's one thing that scales don't do when you warm up. There's basically no fifth finger in your scales.
Right.
So I have some Chopin and Debussy etudes. Get that fourth and fifth finger working. And I'm sure if any classical pianists heard me do that, they'd hang their head in shame, because I'm no classical player. But it helps get me warm, and it helps get the blood flowing. So I'm a big believer, especially among modern jazz pianists. So many of them have studied classical piano in depth. And I'm a big believer that, if you want to be a really high-level jazz pianist, some amount of classical study is definitely advantageous.
You've published some etudes, have you not?
I wrote a book of perpetual motion etudes, which is a style.
That's what I thought. Through Hal Leonard?
That book actually is self-published. But
it's
I have other books for...
Where do they get that? On your website?
On my website or on Amazon, yeah.
Oh, okay, great. That's awesome. Okay, so let's shift gears just a little bit.
I think we left theory a little while ago.
Oh yeah, yeah. We're in the technique, dude. We're in the technique.
Cool. Okay, I didn't even know this.
Yeah, because it all kind of runs together, right?
It does.
So harmonic skills. I don't know about you, but students have a lot of questions and struggle quite a bit with learning voicings. How to voice sound. How did you go about, think back to when you were a child, when you were developing and learning, when did voicings start to make sense to you, how to voice, and what was the tipping point for you? What helped you kind of be able to wrap your mind, your hands, and your ears around how to voice as a jazz pianist?
It's really hard to remember back that far now that I'm as old as I am. But I could tell you I started taking jazz lessons from a really great teacher named Linda Martinez when I was 13 or 14 years old. And I feel like I teach pretty much what she taught me. And I like to start voicings very formulaically. I teach thirds and sevenths in the left hand, fifth and ninth in the right hand. For me, if scales and etudes are the first part of a practice session, probably going through 2-5-1s is the second part of a practice session. and it takes a ton of muscle memory, and then you work on tunes, and the first month you're probably gonna have to write out all your voicings for all the tunes. And this is one thing that I'm always frustrated with students, if I'm being honest. To me, it's really important at the beginning to write everything out, because
I call it paper practice.
Yeah, that's great. The balance between thinking of what you have to play and then actually executing it, that's a lot to do at the same time. So at first you have to separate. So the first 10 tunes you learn good voicings for, you probably want to write them all out and then practice them to get them under your hands and into muscle memory. And then you want to get a real book or a fake book and open it up to a random page every day and go through the tune 10 times until you can kind of get it in time with the voicings without writing them down. But honestly, then the best thing that you can do is to find some stupid gig that you're playing for 2 to 3 hours every week, or if not a gig, just a jam session or a school band, where you're finding the voicings, because it takes a massive amount of repetition, right? It's like a language learning skill. But in addition to learning the language, you have to be able to execute it on the keyboard, right?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
So you just have to do it over and over and over. And if you can't find anybody to play with, put on your favorite record and play along with them as though they were your friends, as though they were your band, right? I spent a lot of time doing that, just playing, okay, Autumn Leaves. I'm going to turn on the Cannonball Adderley recording of Autumn Leaves. It's about 8 minutes. I'm going to do it 5 times. 40 minutes of practice just playing those same voicings. And by the way, while you're doing that, you're going to pick up a bunch of things about style, right? You're going to be able to listen to how Hank Jones is comping and be like, oh, I want to kind of try that rhythm. And then you're going to be able to listen to, the Art Blakey's ride cymbal pattern and latch onto that. So you've got to spend some time playing. I have a student who's a really talented classical pianist and is trying to get into jazz, and she's got a lot of frustration, and I think she, is having a hard time bridging the theoretical concepts with actually doing it. And I've been telling her that, it's like if you're learning to drive, you can talk about driving all day, but where you're actually going to gain skills is behind the wheel. And so, it's particularly hard right now when we're all kind of quarantined. We can't really play in bands. But I told her, you got to just put on albums and play for 45 minutes a day so that you're getting that time behind the wheel, because there's just no replacing that. You can talk about it. We can theorize. We can make plans. But until you're behind that wheel, you're not going to figure out how to drive.
Well, that's right. I say that same thing about, time, and you can't teach time. You can't teach feel. We can talk about it, but you have to experience it in order to develop it.
Absolutely.
And like you said, the best way to experience it when I grew up playing, the only way to experience when I grew up was to go to the jam session. You'd actually go to a jam session and sit in and play, and you'd find out real quick how good your time is.
Yeah.
your sense of time and your sense of feel and articulation, you'd find out really quick, right? But playing with the albums is a great way to do that as well. It's fantastic. So along those lines, rhythmic skills, do you have any specific rhythmic exercises that you do with students that you have them do to develop rhythmic skills?
So comping, I start them off with some basic comping patterns. And before I kind of throw them into the fire doing them with tunes, I have them do the comping patterns against scales. And I'll give you just a quick overview if you want. The first thing that we do is Charleston and reverse Charleston. So Charleston being and reverse Charleston being 2, 3, 4. Right. And what's been interesting is I had them also do the scales with triplets, so that they really have to know how that swing feel works. Right. I'm scared to demonstrate this, but let's see how it goes. Right? Or right? So we did a bunch of that, and then trying to get them to do those 2 comping patterns against a simple melody, whether that's a Take the A Train or a Satin Doll.
Right.
And then also what I call the Red Garland comping pattern, which is the end of 2 and the end of 4 anticipations. So, and then getting that against tunes. And then from there, I have them do what I call push-offs, which are adding downbeats to those offbeats. So 1, 2, 3.
Nice.
And making sure that they get that articulation right, because it's hard for people to stay in the key and really get that legato to staccato. So those are a couple of rhythmic exercises I do. And, something else that I've become really interested in is how pianists start and end phrases. Because especially when people don't have a great sense of jazz style, they tend to start and end everything on downbeats.
Correct.
So I've done a lot of exercises, starting people with a simple rhythm. Maybe it's just one and. So 1, 2, and then you got a solo on a whole tune just using one and. So if it's on a blues, 2, 3, 4. Right, and then add the and of 4 to that. And once they get that, then you can add 1 and 2 and. So we're always practicing ending on that and with a little, I call it a little bit of a sting or a do-dit, Right, and then if they have those two, then let's practice alternating. And now we're starting to build rhythmic vocabulary. This is something I'm passionate about, that, we talk about maybe building a vocabulary of licks or building a vocabulary of scales, but we also need to have a rhythmic vocabulary. People kind of take rhythm for granted. Like, oh, of course I know rhythm. But
it's kind of like it gets shoved off to the side.
Right. But just like anything else, you have to have a vocabulary of rhythms that sound good. And also, for a lot of students, articulation is really tough. And so you need to know how to articulate those rhythms correctly. In the style.
Right. The other thing you were doing there, which is so important to get students to do, you were singing those rhythms.
Yeah, I do that subconsciously. I forget that I'm doing it.
But right, the hands have to take dictation. It's coming from somewhere, and so getting students to sing. I'm always trying to encourage. I'm encouraging students to do that. I'm going like, look, you're not trying to be Luciano Pavarotti here. This is not about singing this is about articulating those rhythms correctly.
Right. Yeah. That's always a tough one because so many students are very reticent to sing. And then it always comes to the question of, okay, are you singing what you're playing or are you playing what you're singing? And, that's a hard one it's a hard one to control.
Right,
you want it to be, of course, coming from the inner ear to the hands. But I think for a lot of students who you might say, well, you should sing along. They're just going to sing what they're playing. So it's a tough one to get. And I think there's a lot of groundwork that has to be done before just expecting a student to be able to play what they sing and have those two things really align. I don't have all the answers there. But I think you're right that the goal should be, to have something come from the inner ear through the body and the hands.
Something's coming from inside. It's inside out.
Absolutely. And I think there's a lot of scaffolding between theory and these rhythms that has to be done before, a student's going to get there. But that's the job. That's the gig.
All right, man. How about oral skills? The ear.
The answer is yes.
Hearing sounds, harmonic function. Yeah. What do you do, man?
It's funny. So I'm the worst person to ask about this in a lot of ways because I've had perfect pitch for as long as I can remember. And so, I've had students come to me and say, wow, you have such a great ear. Tell me about your ear training regimen. I say, I never did one. I never did anything. So, in a lot of ways, I'm actually the least qualified person. I think singing solos, is paramount. I think being able to sing the roots of tunes is paramount. Singing is the best way to gauge whether your ear is doing the right thing. Right? There's not a really great other way to gauge. I don't know if you know about this. I believe it's David Baker's transcription method, although it's come down to me through some different folks. But the method is basically that you listen to a solo until you can sing it, and then you write it down away from your instrument. Right? And boy, do you
Right.
have to
Yes.
know,
Right.
your
Right.
ear has to be so good and so connected to do that. And then you go to your instrument and you see how you did.
Validate
Um,
it. Right.
and I think that that's a really great test, because so many people transcribe and it's just trial and error, right? They'll hear a note and they'll, okay, yeah, it was an F, right? So I think spending that time away from the instrument, really figuring out, do I know how a major six sounds different than a minor six? Am I totally confident in that? I think that's, really, really essential. And then the other element, which I'm always trying to preach to my students, and of course it's one of those things that's easier to tell people they should do than to actually, teach them to do,
Right.
is to hear ahead in the tune. Because I hear so many younger musicians and college-age musicians who play pretty well, but it's always in response to the harmony, and they always sound like they're late. Instead of, let's lead you to that third, let's lead you to that next sound. And also, let's hear where there's a dissonance that needs to be resolved. So really listening to that, how is the harmony moving? How does it relate to that melody line? So some things that help are being able to sing guide tones to pieces, right? Being able to hear resolutions. But like I said, I wish, I'm sure there's somebody who has like an amazing ear training regiment that taught them to do something. I can't share anything like that with you.
Right.
But those are the things
Yeah.
that I've heard that seem to work really well for people.
So with tunes though, when you learn a tune, how does harmonic function play into that for you? I mean, you're hearing one going to six, going to two, going to five. You're hearing harmonic motion,
Yeah,
correct?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Um,
So do you spend time with students trying to get them to hear harmonic motion? Like, oh, that's a 2 chord going to a 5 chord, going to a 1 chord. They may not have the perfect pitch, right? Like you, they may not be able to say, oh, that's in the key of C, so that's a D minor going to a G7. But they would be able to say to you, oh, that's a two. I'm hearing 2-5-1 there. Oh, I'm hearing rhythm changes. Right?
yeah, that's a level that we want students to get to for sure. Tune learning goes so slow at first, but once you figure
Right.
out, both how these common progressions sound, how they feel,
Yes.
how they kind of function,
Right.
tune learning can go
Right.
very fast,
Right.
right?
Right.
And I know it's a frustration of a lot of students that there's so many tunes to learn, and it takes so long to really process one, much less learn how to transpose it or
Right.
anything like that. So yeah, we do want to get our students to that level where they're not like really laboring through learning those tunes. And I think
Correct.
you're absolutely right that that figuring out those really common progressions is the way to go.
Yeah.
Um,
Understanding those relationships. I'll tell you a funny story. When I was a kid, I was maybe, I don't know, 14, 15 years old, and I said to this old jazzer that was playing in town, he was a really very fine jazz pianist, and I'm sitting there watching him. He could play any tune, any key, any way you wanted it. Singers were coming up all the time requesting tunes, but always in different keys, and he'd play them. And I asked him one time, I said, man, how do you know so many tunes? I said, I've never seen you not be able to play a tune, to play any requested tune in any key. How is it that you know so many tunes? And he looked at me. He was an old crusty guy at this time, and I'm just a kid, right? And he looked at me like I was asking him the dumbest question on the face of planet Earth. And he looked at me, took his little cigar out of his mouth, and he goes, what are you talking about? He said, now check this out. This is what he said. He goes, what are you talking about? They're all the same. And as a kid, I was going like, what the heck's he talking about? He's he's wacky, right? Misty's not the same as San Francisco, is not the same as Autumn Leaves, is not the same, right? But then, 35, 40 years later, I know exactly what he's talking about. He's hearing, 2-5-1 is 2-5-1. Right? So he's hearing all those tunes. He's hearing those relationships. He's hearing that common motion, those patterns. So much so that he thinks they're what? All the same.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, that's a pretty high level of musical thinking.
For sure. Yeah, I have a few thoughts on that. One, is just like an old person rant against iReal Pro. As useful as it is, it's become such an incredible crutch. And
Yes.
one of the best pieces of advice I got from John Clayton, the great bass player in high school, and he said, "Burn your real book." If you have this thing
Yeah,
to
right.
look towards, you're never really going to be
Right.
engaging with the music, right? The more we're using our eyes, the
Correct.
less we're using our ears. And I just know so
That's
many,
exactly right.
professional level musicians, college level musicians who barely know any tunes because they're on iReal Pro. And the great musicians that I
Right.
know, and I've tried this a couple of times with mixed success. If they're on a bandstand and somebody calls a tune they don't know, I've done this. I'll just say, "Oh, I know that," and then I'll listen for one chorus and then I'll play it after that, right? Because that's what you want to be able to do. You want to just be able to listen once through and more or less get it. You're maybe not going to get the details of a really hard tune. You got to be careful what you're faking. Um,
Right.
two more things.
Right.
Another, of course, a great ear exercise at every single level is transposition. Um, and transposition is kind of interesting because depending on how you do it, it can be a real theory brain experience or it can be a real ear experience, right? And I think you want to be able to do a little bit of both, right? You want to be able to know the tune well enough that you can think about it and know the functions, but you also, it's much more reliable and much more fun to be able to hear your way to that new key. So transposition is one of those activities that never goes away. I'll never forget I'm a student of the great Fred Hirsch. One of the things that he told me about his solo concerts is that he likes to not play a tune in the key he's going to play it in until he gets on stage. Because he wants that key to be fresh when he gets on stage, which is so cool and also so ballsy, right? Like,
Oh, there's no. Yeah, I was just going to say that's wow. I was going to say, man, that sounds great in theory, but I don't think I want to try
that's how
that.
good his ear is. That's how much he trusts
Holy
it.
moly!
Like he's like, oh, if I can play this in these 5 other keys, I can definitely play it in this one key, and it's going to be fresh and surprising even to me. Isn't that cool? I just love that.
Yeah, it's pretty phenomenal, right? That's amazing. Ultimately, that's what that's ultimately what we want to do.
Yeah, we want to have that trust that we can get on stage and play any key, anytime, any tune. And I ain't at that level, but I'm working on it.
We live in a day and age now where there are, anthologies of transcriptions. You can go out and purchase a collection of Bill Evans transcriptions or a collection of Oscar Peterson transcriptions. What value, if any, do you find in somebody studying transcriptions that they didn't transcribe?
Yeah, I think there's a whole range of reasons to look at transcriptions, and I think it's all valid as long as as long as you're getting out of it what you intend to get out of it, right? You could,
Correct.
just like we study classical scores, you can study the score of a Bill Evans transcription and figure out, oh, this is the substitution he's using, or this is the kind of voicing that sounds like this. And I think that's totally valid. If you're trying to train your ear, that's not the best way to go, right? If that's what it's doing. But if you're just kind of curious and you want to gain some things, my big I think it all depends what you're trying to get out of it. My big crusade with transcriptions is what happens after you play the transcription, analyze the transcription, is that you have to then bring those things into a bunch of tunes, right? If you discover that Bill Evans, I don't know, let's say he's using a sharp 5 to 5 resolution on a major 7th, then that's important. And then you need to go to every tune you learn and you need to play it using that in every single place. If you're playing audibly, right, you do it where you get to the major 7th chord. And that's a step that I see students not necessarily taking advantage of. They're checking the box of, oh, I did the transcription, I wrote it down, I learned it, or maybe I learned it from a different source. But then you need to adopt all the things that you love from that transcription and make your own.
That's exactly. Well, now you're talking about really getting to the gold, right? That's the real treasure. If you're just taking the transcription on the surface and trying to take a line, a lick, if you will, and then drop kick it into some other tune that you're trying to play, I always tell students, well, good luck with that, right? Good luck. What you're talking about is really kind of opening up the window inside of Bill Evans' mind, trying to see what he does, and as a result, extracting from you ideas that come from you then on the shoulders of Bill Evans.
Yeah, absolutely. My teacher in high school was the great Tamir Hendelman. He's one of the best jazz pianists in LA. Just an incredible teacher, person, pianist. I remember that we would do transcriptions, and he would say, "Okay, next week bring in 3 melodic, 3 harmonic, and 3 rhythmic ideas that you like from the transcription,
right?
And I want to hear you apply them to tunes." And I love that. I love that format. Because it's not just, okay, pick a lick and learn it in every key, which is valuable. There's a place for that. I'm not saying never do that.
Right.
But that's going to be useful, such a slim amount of the time.
Correct.
It's like memorizing one line of poetry. It's like, okay, how much are you going to be able to deliver that line in context? Probably not great much.
Yeah, great analogy.
Versus, if you want to figure out what the syntax is, what's the grammar, and then, okay, I can use that a bunch of places. I can use that same grammar all over the place.
Right.
And then I can become a poet instead of just somebody who quotes poetry.
Correct.
You can use that format of 1 melodic, 3 melodic, 3 harmonic, 3 rhythmic ideas, and then use those as a bouncing off place to expand exponentially from that transcription.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Now there is value in just getting these transcriptions under your fingers, because just like I said earlier about learning the bebop melodies, you just need to feel for what it feels like to play jazz, and it might challenge you technically. It might get your hands into some positions you weren't used to being in. There's a ton of value, and then when you play it along with the transcription, then you're working on your rhythm and time feel. When you play it along with the original recording, is what I meant to say. You're working on your rhythm and time feel. So. There's value in every stage of this and in every part that you do with it. But I just hate seeing students miss that last step of really owning that material.
Correct.
Because that's so satisfying, and it encourages so much valuable growth.
Right. If you were, you teach, the students that you teach, primarily college level, correct? You teach younger children?
I have a few high school. I have one 13-year-old.
Okay.
A little bit of a mix.
So if you were somebody comes to you, regardless of what age they are, and let's say they come from maybe a classical background, or they've played kind of a traditional. They've had a traditional music lesson experience in learning how to play the piano, but now they want to start developing some jazz skills.
Yeah.
What are some of the very first steps that you have them begin doing to make that transition into the jazz world?
Great question. So one of the first exercises that I do, especially with people from a classical background, because usually they're very comfortable with scales, is I do what I call my scale exercise, my world famous scale exercise, kind of as a joke. And what I have them do, just to get them used to the idea of quote unquote improvising, and I know that this isn't creative or engaging the ear at all, but just to get them kind of their feet wet, I have them play just consistent eighth notes with the scale. But they're not allowed to play the scale in order or in any kind of a pattern. So if they're playing the C major scale, they'll play. And I have them do it with a timer. So you have to do it for 1 minute without stopping. And again, I know that this isn't jazz, it's not engaging their ear, but for me, the first thing I want to do is to break down those barriers between something that's written out and something that's improvised. And so here's taking this material they know, giving them very specific directions to get them playing something that's not written out, that's not completely prescribed to them. So that's one of the first things that I'll do with them. I try to get into voicings pretty early, because usually what students want to do and what they really need to do is to play with a group. And the first thing they're going to need to know is, of course, how do you form these basic kinds of chords, but then they're going to need to know some voicings and some 2-5-1s. So I'll give them voicings, and I'll give them those 2 comping patterns that I mentioned earlier, and take some simple tunes that only have major 2-5-1s. Tune Up is a great one to start with. That's not going to have any tricky half diminished or anything. And I get them just doing some simple comping, hopefully with some decent voicings.
Right.
A big thing. So then probably from there, some of our first improvisation exercises will be with blues because, right,
Right.
blues, there's a million things that you can bring to it, but the blues scale is such a great place to start because they don't have to change scales every chord. So I'll have them do, and usually I'll try to give them very specific phrasing. I'll have them do play two, rest two on the blues.
Right.
And
Yes,
then,
that's good.
because otherwise they do, some musical diarrhea and so instead, I'll give them, okay, you got two measures to play, and then you got to rest for two measures. And it's
That's
also a
very
good way
good, man.
to get that left hand incorporated, because then once they get it with just the right hand, they can play that left hand comping in those two blank measures. So,
Yeah, and you're teaching them to play space. You know what I mean? Play space.
Yeah, absolutely. Another exercise, especially with students who are, from a classical background, is I'll have them write what I call a dream solo. So that, just like we talked about earlier with your paper practice, they're just separating out those two elements of creating and performing. Because it's very intimidating to do both of those at the same time.
Right.
So I'll have them write out some dream solos, and it's also a good opportunity to quote unquote correct or try to improve some elements of rhythm or form, because it's really hard to catch those things when you're just listening to an improvisation. You might say, well, you've been playing a lot of D flats on the F blues, and they might say, no, I haven't. And then what do? You say, well, I'm pretty sure that you were. Right. Or you might say you're starting all your phrases on downbeats, and I need you to start some of your phrases on offbeats, and they might not be able to make that adjustment. So if you have it all down there on paper, you can point out, okay, this D flat, that's not part of the blues scale, and you're starting every single phrase right on beat one of bar one. So let's see if we can move that around a little bit. So those are a few of the first steps that I take with students. Every student is so different, and it's tough. I don't have a formula that works every time. It's always slow going because it's language learning, and I always tell it to students, like, how long would you expect it take to learn how to speak French? It's like, well, don't expect to learn to be a great improviser in one semester. Don't expect to get to that level. You're really going to have to put in the time, and it's a long process of a lot of dedication.
Right. That's right. Do you have any specific improvisation exercises that, apart from transcriptions, apart from, scales or technique work, do you have any exercises that are geared toward developing improvisational lines, improvisational motion?
It's hard to narrow down from there. I think all improvisation exercises deal with limitations, right? Right, because improvisation by its nature is supposedly free. So any improvisation exercise is going to be some series of limitations. And some examples of limitations that I think are really useful would be hit the third on every downbeat. It would be start every phrase with a leap of a sixth or a seventh. Leaps are one of my big passions for young improvisers because they so often just keep their hands very closed. And leaps add expression, and leaps add really important rhythm. So sometimes I'll say you have to start every phrase with a leap of more than a fifth. That could be an improvisation exercise. It could be, like we talked about, these simple rhythms and building off of simple rhythms. It could be using a chromatic enclosure into the downbeat of every measure. It could be starting every phrase with a 3-5-7-9 arpeggio. There's a million kinds of limitations. If you're working on octatonic scales, every time you get to a dominant chord, I want you to use the octatonic scale. And then I also do a lot of solo scripting with my students. And what I mean by solo scripting is, we'll have one phrase or one idea that will be like, okay, we know we're putting that in measures 3 and 4. Let's improvise around that, and we're going to hit that in measures 3 and 4. So that they get used to integrating some of the vocabulary that they've been learning with improvisation. Because I find that students, like I say, my students who are really good box checkers learn that vocabulary and then have no idea how to use it. And can't really shift between improvising and then playing something a little bit more prepared. So it's like, okay, let's, this is the hard part of the tune. We're going to put this here. Something else I'll do sometimes, especially with younger students, is figure out hand positions and then have them improvise within hand positions. If harmony is moving really fast, it's always the end of ornithology that stumps students. How's it go?
Right.
They're doing okay, and then it's like they get there, and I was like, forget it. So I teach them some hand positions. I say, okay, let's go, and then from there, okay, that's interesting. You could go up, or you could leap. Let's get you don't have to use every note in every hand position. So that's a nice way, especially for some of those really tricky places. Every student can find those hand positions pretty easily. And then, the assignment is, can you come up with 10 different melodies that you could make using those same hand positions? So those are a few ideas.
Yeah, that's fantastic. It ultimately comes down to shapes and sounds, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's what I tell students all the time. Jazz, it's a study of shapes and sounds. And, that's a beautiful illustration of that, what you just demonstrated there. That's awesome. It's tremendous. So, okay, look, we've covered a lot of ground today.
Yes, we have.
I could sit here and do this for 6 hours straight, man. But you know what? Share with, we've gone through this whole time together, but take a second right now and share with the listeners your background. You're teaching right now. You're out in California, right? And you're teaching at Fullerton?
Fullerton College, that's right.
Yeah, that's fantastic. How long you been there?
This is the my fourth year.
Wow. So what led you to teaching?
Great question. So I'd love to stand here and say that what led me to teaching was that I have some high-minded, whatever. But probably more than anything, it was financial necessity. And that's not to say that I don't love teaching. And the more that I do it, the more I'm really interested in getting better at it and figuring out how to get to the student. It's fascinating to try to get students from the point where they, for example, can't improvise to the point where they do feel comfortable improvising. And yeah, I'm trying to think. I'm kind of a theory guy and a word guy, and it's really fascinating to me to try to make some of these really complicated concepts as clear as possible. And how do I explain these really tricky, ethereal concepts, but make them actually, worthwhile and clear to a student who might not be in their vocabulary to think about those things. So I just find it full of interesting problems to solve. That's what I love about it. And of course, I love the people. I love meeting students, hopefully having a positive impact in their lives.
Absolutely. You're an author. You've produced a lot of educational content material, right? At Hal Leonard. Talk a little bit about this, and you have a relatively new book out, right, on solo piano playing.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about that.
So I've kind of stumbled unintentionally into the piano pedagogy world, which is really interesting. And the way that I got into it is that I got hired to review jazz materials for Clavier Companion, which is now called the Piano Magazine. And so for about, 7 or 8 years, all of the jazz piano materials came across my desk, and some are good and some are not so good. But very few are actually written by real jazz pianists. And very few of them do a good job of pointing students towards the real things, which, I consider the recordings are the real things. As much as I want everybody to buy my books and spend money, I want all of my books to point towards the oral learning that you have to do through jazz. Because you can't learn jazz through a book. And so my mission with all of my educational materials is to give students something that's written by a real jazz pianist and has real content that's developed from the masters. And secondly, to have that pointing them, whether it's just through the title of a tune having to do with Thelonious Monk, or some of my materials list recordings and improvisation exercises that students can do to really get them towards the real information. But I am particularly proud. It was my quarantine passion project to write this book, Playing Solo Jazz Piano, which is just it was a massive project, and it's basically everything that I know about solo piano playing, which is one of my favorite things as an introvert, and as somebody just fascinated with the instrument of the piano, to figure out everything you could do with this art form. And there's no other book that I'm aware that's really like it, and it covers everything. There's 4 chapters about stride piano. I love stride piano. It starts with 4 chapters of everything that I'm aware that you could do with stride piano. It gets into traditional swing techniques. It gets into shared hand voicings and what you can do with those. There's 4 chapters about ballad playing and different ballad styles, and then there's 4 chapters about modern techniques. Among them, perpetual motion, counterpoint. How do you learn how to improvise with counterpoint? A full solo piano arrangement. If you're a fan of Brad Mehldau, incorporating classical music techniques. If you want to improvise something that sounds like Debussy, but do it on leaves, how would you go about doing that? So it's just the broad spectrum of everything that I love and I've studied. And I was lucky enough to have Fred Hirsch write the introduction to the book. And I'm really proud of it. And so that's available on my website and on Amazon.
Yeah, and at your website, I understand that it's you autograph all
that is true. And
woo!
If you're debating, by the way, I keep much more of the profit if you buy it from my website than if you buy it from Amazon. Jeff Bezos gets about 40% of the profit. So, if you're deciding, hopefully the autograph would sway you. But if you want to support, then
hey man, I'm going to buy. I'm going to buy a copy from your website, man. I want the autographed. I want the autographed book, man. So, but solo piano playing. First of all, solo piano playing is not easy.
Yes.
It's not.
No, I usually
solo jazz.
I tell my students, first 2 years we're not really going to get into. And this is my college students. First 2 years we're not really going to get into solo piano playing because you have to have such a solid background. So not until you're a junior in college usually. Of course, I make exceptions.
Yeah.
But you do have to know so much to be a good solo pianist.
Oh my gosh. Right. That's to me, that solo jazz piano playing, that's the tip of the mountain there, man. It's fantastic. And the other thing is there's just not a lot of literature out there on how to approach solo jazz piano. So when I saw your book, I thought, fantastic. Somebody's actually addressing this topic.
Yeah. And I think there's not that much about it because there's not one way to do it. I mean, of course, there's not one way to play any kind of jazz piano, but there's so many different traditions, it's kind of intimidating. And I learned so much, and it clarified my teaching so much to write the book, and to, go and find examples of different artists playing styles in different ways. So hopefully it's a contribution that people appreciate. And like I said, it was my passion project. As soon as all the tours that I was going to do shut down during quarantine, it's like, okay, I got to do something that makes me feel good. So I wrote this book, and like I said, I'm really proud of it.
Oh, that's awesome. So, okay, if you had to, and I know this is an impossible question to answer, but if you had to, who is your favorite solo jazz pianist? Who is your favorite?
Gosh, you're a jerk. What a question.
I know it, man. I'm total jerk.
So
right?
I'm a student of Fred Hirsch, and Fred has innovated in just incredible ways in terms of the way that he plays solo piano. But it feels strange to choose a modern person because any modern person is standing on the shoulders. I'm sure if Fred were here, he would say, "Forget me. Listen to Thelonious Monk. Listen to Hank Jones. Listen to Bill Evans. Listen to all of those greats." Right. The stuff that Brad Mehldau does is mind-blowing. His new, his big box set of 10 Year Solo Live is just absolutely astounding. And I discovered some new pianists, people who I hadn't checked out quite as much. People like Earl Hines, God, I'm blanking on.
Oh, Earl Hines.
Errol Garner. I was aware of him, but I'd never really checked out the solo literature. And man, it's deep and it's so good. So the list just kind of goes on and on. But yeah, modern guys, Fred, Brad, Keith Jarrett is obviously just a complete freak.
Yes,
You'll
right,
see the Thelonious Monk poster right behind me. Monk is certainly
right.
essential. Bill Evans obviously, just contributed hugely to the solo piano tradition. I'm personally just a huge sucker for Hank Jones. I think he's got one of the best touches of any pianist ever. So those are
Yeah,
some of the guys who just personally really move me.
yeah. All great players. I think if I had to pick a gentleman that I absolutely am always blown away with his
Mhm.
playing was Dave
Yeah, I
McKenna.
learned a lot more about Dave McKenna while writing the book because so many people he had such a unique style, right? And so many people cite it.
Oh,
He's
just
yeah, he's
something.
amazing. Seems to have that third hand, right?
He sure
How are you
does,
doing
right?
that?
He plays solo piano, and you swear there's a rhythm section with him, and you go, wait a minute, no, wait a minute, it's just him,
Yeah, and I'm a
So
big Oscar Peterson head too. He was the one who really got me into jazz and his solo stuff. I mean, God dang. But I mean, obviously
it's
the technique is
ridiculous,
there,
right?
and at a certain point you had to put that aside. But then the musicality on top of the technique is just stunning, and the pianism. I mean, that guy could play with a feather-light touch and the balance, and I really grew to appreciate his pedaling on another level. His pedaling is so
Yeah,
detailed and nuanced, and
yeah.
built a
Did you
personality.
ever, did you ever see
I
him in
never got to.
concert?
No.
Did you ever see him? Yeah, I got to see him one time, and of all places, it was at the University of
Okay.
Iowa, and he played solo. He came out and did a solo piano concert there at the University of Iowa, and he played literally solo piano for
Wow.
3 hours.
That's hard.
And it was, oh,
Like,
can you?
that's
I
really
mean,
tough.
his first set was about an hour and a half. He took a little break and he came out and he played another set for an hour and
Unbelievable.
a half.
Yeah, that's wild.
And I'll never forget it. He started on a Duke Ellington. Started playing Duke Ellington tunes, and it ended up being a 30-minute medley of Duke Ellington tunes, just going from one to the
Wow.
next to the next
Yeah,
to the
he
next to
was a
the
freak
next.
in every sense
He was a
and all the
freak.
best senses. And it might actually interest your listeners or yourself. As part of the project, the book, I actually compiled on my website what I'm pretty sure is the most complete list of solo piano recordings anywhere in the world. On my
Wow.
website, you can click. It says solo piano albums list or something. I think there's like over 800 different recordings there. So if you're ever looking for something,
Wow.
I think it's the most complete list on the internet. Um,
Yeah, and your website address is pretty
yeah,
straightforward, right?
JeremySiskind.com. You spell it JeremySiskind.com.
Jeremy is kind. I like it, man. That's awesome. So, Jeremy, it's been a thrill, man. It's been awesome to get to meet you and to spend some time with you and tapping into your mind and the way you think and approach the art. It's fantastic. You're a phenomenal player. I enjoy your music, folks. I encourage everybody to go out to Google and Google Jeremy and check out some recordings out there of him playing. You are in for a treat. And also check out his book, that solo piano playing book that you can get at his website. I highly recommend that. I'm going to finish out here today and I'm going to buy
Oh,
me a
thanks.
copy. So yeah. So Jeremy, thank you so much. If you are ever in the Dallas area, please let me know. Love to get
Yeah.
together with you, man. We'll go out and
Paint the town
have
red.
something to eat and play some and play some jazz piano, man.
Count me in. Count me
All
in.
right.
It's been a thrill. Let's do a part two sometime.
All right, brother. We will, man. For sure. So Jeremy, thanks so much, man. It's
Thank
been
you.
a
The pleasure was
pleasure.
mine.
Well, I hope you have found this Jazz Piano Skills podcast with special guest Jeremy Siskind to be insightful and, of course, beneficial. Don't forget, if you are a Jazz Piano Skills member, I will see you online Thursday evening at the Jazz Piano Skills Masterclass, 8 p.m. Central Time, to discuss this podcast episode with Jeremy Siskind in greater detail. So much to unpack. And to answer any questions that you may have about the study of jazz in general. As always, you can reach me by phone at 972-380-8050, extension 211, by email, Dr. Lawrence at JazzPianoSkills.com. That's drlawrence at JazzPianoSkills.com. Or by SpeakPipe, found on the Jazz Piano Skills website, in the educational podcast packets, and the Jazz Piano Skills courses. Well, that's it for now. And until next week, enjoy the journey, and most of all, have fun as you discover, learn, and play jazz piano.